The Edward Bernays story, maybe we should just start there because it's kind of funny. I was a reporter for the Associated Press in Boston, and my boss said to me, I heard there's this really interesting guy named Edward Bernays, and you know, they're saying he really is invented the field of public relations. We ought to go out and do a story on him. Well, I said, what kind of story? Well, he's pretty old. He's probably going to die. So would you go out and prepare an obituary on this guy? So I went out to Cambridge, Massachusetts. He lives right near Harvard, a couple blocks away. And he agreed to meet with me, so I drove out to his house, and I knocked on the front door, and Edward, who was 91 at the time, came to the door and said, "You're here to do my obituary, aren't you?" And so I wound up doing this story about this guy who had in fact invented the field of public relations and had pioneered some extraordinary public affairs campaigns. He had served as an advisor to 6 US presidents, as well as people like Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Nijinsky, Caruso. It sort of was a walk through the 20th century. So I did this piece. He's a really interesting guy. Oh, I didn't mention, he's Sigmund Freud's nephew. And I later learned had this tremendous trove of letters from his uncle that no one had ever looked at in his attic. Anyway, it was kind of one of those stories that every time you looked, it had another really interesting angle. So I thought I had a pretty good story going. You know, all of these things he did for Edison and so forth. And my editor came back and said, well, did you ask him if he has ever turned down any people? No, I didn't think to ask that, but sure, good question, I'll go back. And so I said to Edward, look, anybody ever approach you to do campaigns that you refused? And he kind of got this smile and said, yeah, Adolf Hitler wanted me to do something on the train system in Germany. Apparently he didn't realize I was Jewish. Normally when I speak, Gino omitted the traditional caveats. I'm not a public speaker, I'm not an educator. I'm a writer, I'm a reporter, and generally what happens in life is that you figure out fairly early on if you're better with the written word than the spoken word. That's clearly on the written word side of things. But what I thought I might talk about tonight on the spur of the moment is just about the changes in media that all of us are experiencing globally right now. And trust me, as someone who's been in the media business for my entire life, there has never been anything like this since the time of Gutenberg. The traditional media is dying. In the United States, you can't walk down the street and not realize that. The newspaper racks are empty. People don't carry them on the trains. You won't find anybody under 30 reading a newspaper. Television is boring. It's getting more and more opinionated, and you have, you know, this one major outlet that, you know, can't do anything but say wonderful things about the right wing, and then of course you have the other side, and there's, you know, and essentially the whole thing is falling apart. And as you all know, it's being replaced by citizen media, citizen journalism. And there's something that's really wonderful about that, and there's something that's really exciting about it, and the power of it is almost beyond belief. And I want to talk a little bit about that in a second. There's also something a little scary about it, though. And let me say what that is. There was a time when people would invest their whole lives in trying to discern what is truth. And how do we parse between fact and fiction? And if somebody says this is true, can we check, can we verify it and tell people, yeah, this guy actually called it right, or he's lying? There was a time when news organizations would spend untold millions of dollars pursuing wrongdoing by their government, by corporations. I gotta tell you, that's just flat gone. It isn't happening anymore, and that's a tragedy. So that's one of the scary things. But the other thing that's scary is, okay, fine, I think we can live with that, because the citizen media part of it is so empowering and it's so exciting that maybe there's cool stuff that happens that replaces, you know. Yeah, but it assumes that people are going to develop a sophistication as consumers. And they're going to be able, excuse me, to sort through fact themselves, to seek additional substantiation, to give scrutiny to the source of the story and figure out whether they have an axe to grind. And to me, it's stunning. Thank you. But there is not a university anywhere that I know of that is teaching critical skills in media consumption. Now, how important is that? I ask you. Here we're being deluged with information. The digital world has essentially turned a fire hose of facts and information loose on you. And there's no barrier there to keep you from drowning. There is no fact checking. There are no standards that people are learning to live with to assess the validity of the information they're being pounded with. And increasingly what we're finding is we're even more susceptible than we were before to moneyed interests who can manipulate it because there aren't safeguards that used to be in place. So that's kind of my two-bit rant for tonight. And let me just say that anybody wants to ask questions, don't hesitate, just raise your hand. I'll try and be brief so that we can talk a little bit and, you know, explore what you guys think is interesting as opposed to what I think is interesting. So, I thought I would mention a thing that has happened within the last month with me very personally, and it bears on all of these things. And I hope you'll find it somewhat illuminating as you think about the conjunction of traditional media, digital media, and social networking. Okay, because like it or not, we are all today in Michelangelo's Venice. So, a bit of background, won't dwell on it, but in addition to this life as a grown-up that I have, I also have this fantasy life in which I launched a nonprofit, an NGO, and our goal is to raise money for Mayan children in Guatemala who have had centuries and centuries of discrimination and look, genocide, let's call it what it is. So I founded this NGO with a buddy of mine who's an archaeologist, one of the preeminent Mayan scholars in the world. He's a professor at Boston University, and his name is Dr. Francisco Estrada Belay. He's a Guatemalan national and he's part Mayan. So we created a logo, and I want to show you that logo, because it basically, we thought it was kind of cool, but you know, it's nothing that spectacular. What it has is a picture of a Mayan temple and a species of toucan that's indigenous to the Guatemalan rainforest in the area where we have our NGO. And we went through the process of having that logo trademarked. 13 months into that, I got a letter from Kelloggs North America, who said, "We are filing a formal opposition to your effort to trademark this, and unless you cease and desist in the use of that logo, we will sue you. Because we have a character called Toucan Sam." Toucan Sam is a cartoon toucan that is used by Kelloggs to encourage children to eat, what would you call it? Sugar-based product, right? It's not food, it's some kind of, sugar substance cereal. I was a little surprised. Kellogg's wanted to take on this little tiny, non-profit that's, working to support indigenous people in Central America, but hey, they're the ones that decided to do it. But it pissed me off, and pissed off my wife, who's my attorney. And so we decided, okay, let's jerk their chains just a little bit. Now, the first thing we did was kind of take a look about who are these guys and why do they care about our toucan, right? So we started doing a little research. And it turns out, well, they have a children's game in which the children visit a Maya temple. And in the temple, there is an evil witch doctor who steals the Fruit Loops from the little white children in the temple. The witch doctor is the only person of color in the entire cartoon. He's depicted as cackling malevolently, he has a huge nose, and he's pretty damn scary. Well, the fact that he was positioned in Temple 1 at Tikal, which I'm sure Kellogg didn't know, that's kind of their holiest of holies. And they're depicting a Mayan as a witch doctor, as an evil person. Well, that sucks. That pisses me off even more. But then you look further and you find out that they have another child's game, which is the evil Kung Fu Koi Master, which is a game in which children enter a cartoon world with Toucan Sam and encounter a caricature of an Asian. And in this caricature, the evil Kung Fu Koi Master is depicted as being a fish with yellow skin, slanted eyes, Fu Manchu, and guess what? He steals from the white children. Well, that pissed us off a little more. And it turns out they had a whole series of games, which they refer to as their adventure series, Toucan Sam's Adventure Series. Kind of felt to me like Adventures in Racism. Kind of felt to me like, okay, is there a way that we could introduce the idea of racism to little children on the backs of our cereal boxes and in televised commercials so that they can kind of suck down these racist attitudes along with their sugar? Their lawyer called, bullied us a little bit, and we decided, well, shit, let's make them famous. This is where we get into the use of the media. And I want to tell you a little bit about how this came down, because I hope it's somewhat instructive. But they picked kind of the wrong people in terms of not getting famous in the media, as I mentioned. I'm a media person. I worked for the Associated Press for 30 years. I know a little bit about that business. So we wrote a press release talking about Kellogg's racist attitudes. And we quoted Dr. Estrada Belli as saying, this is a little bit like the Washington Redskins football team suing the National Council of American Indians for trademark infringement. And went on to say all sorts of compelling, interesting things. What a lot of people don't know is that it is fairly simple to get traditional media coverage, we know how to do it. There are a number of companies that provide communications services that serve all of the media all around the world. And you know what? They're really cheap. So we crafted this press release and sent it out for $550 on something called the Business Wire. There's a number of them, PR Newswire, the Business Wire, and so forth. What a lot of people don't realize is that traditional media, these guys would put out a press release and it would land on some editor's desk in a newsroom. Nowadays, a Business Wire press release automatically, without anyone even looking at it, appears on something over 2,500 websites around the world. So within 24 hours of our sending out this press release, this got passed along and passed along and passed along, and we were on 3,000 websites in 90 countries. So that's the traditional media part of it. Then you start trying to figure out how you use something called social networking. And essentially what we did, it's real straightforward, not particularly complicated, but you know it can work. And that is, well, we got this news organization to actually do a story. That's pretty cool. Here's this press release on this website. And essentially what we started doing is posting links to these various news stories on every social networking site we could. So we have my Facebook page, my Google Plus page, my kids, you know, my son was helping me a lot with this, with my archaeology initiative page, with every other page out there that we could think of. And then you know what happened is other people would say, hey, that's kind of an interesting rap, and you know what? Those Kellogg's people are assholes. I think I'll post that on my page. I think I'll Twitter about that and send out the link there. Within 3 days of sending out this press release, according to Google, we had 1.2 million hits on websites globally. Kellogg's was not happy. They called up my wife and wanted to cry on her shoulder about, gosh, we really didn't know you were going to do this. Well, you should have thought about it before you threatened to sue us. Well, we're willing to drop our trademark infringement suit against you guys. Not good enough. You've spent millions of dollars maligning people. It's going to cost some money to fix that. We want to build a culture center for the Maya, and we think you ought to fund it. You know, those schools down there really suck. You need to build some. Well, that was last week before I got on a plane and came over here to work in Hong Kong. But suffice to say, and I'll just wind up my little wrap on this by saying that Kellogg's is offering a very significant amount of money, none of which is going to go to us. It's going straight to Guatemala. And they're giving us space on their cereal boxes all around the world for 3 months. So we're working with them labs on potentially building a game to start to educate people on Mayan culture. Start talking about who their deities are, what are some of the things they invented, and they're not small things. You know, they domesticated corn for the first time, they invented chocolate, they, you know, all kinds of astrological things. They had one of the most complex systems of mathematics of anyone, and that whole culture has been lost. So I guess the reason that I wanted to tell that story is simply to say, hey, you know, there's some very significant things that we've lost. And God help us if young people growing up don't start learning critical media skills and assess whether they're being bullshitted. Pretty important, pretty important. But also because I wanted to just tell a story that makes me feel good about what can be done if you understand media, if you know how to use media, if you understand the basic media skills involved in getting out a story, particularly a story if you have a voice of moral authority. So, with that said, I could talk more, but I'm not going to. I'll just stop here and see if anybody has questions. People just quiet? Always.
Well, can you share with us a little bit about your time at the Associated Press and what you did there, and just how you saw media shifting and kind of why you left there as media was shifting?
Yeah. Okay, in my last job, I had a number of them. A long time I was the bureau chief for California and Nevada, so I had responsibility for Hollywood and for all kinds of bizarre stuff that happens in California. But our CEO asked me to come over and
actually, before you do that, can you give some of them may not be familiar, too familiar with AP. Can you tell a little bit about Associated Press?
Sure. AP is the largest news organization in the world. It is a media collective that originally was started by U.S. newspapers, but spread to some 12,000 broadcast outlets around the world, and about 6,000 newspapers in every country around the world.
You know what? I'm going to write down the Chinese name on the board. They will know it by the Chinese name.
Please. So the AP. AP has
got it?
okay.
Oh, yeah.
Makes sense, huh?
Right.
Sorry, thank you for doing that. Yeah, that's interesting. You refer to it as the American News thing. Let me tell you, as the top executive of that company, when you go around Asia, it matters what people think about whoever happens to be the president at that point. There was a time when Bill Clinton was around where people thought it was really cool. You're American, must be an okay guy. Then the next guy came in, and people couldn't get you out of their office fast enough because you must be the mouthpiece for George Bush, and so forth. But at any rate, so I worked with the AP across 33 countries in Asia, where the media would be in, as you can probably imagine, various states of health. In some places, Korea, Japan, for example, extremely healthy. Throughout almost all of the rest of Asia, the media is collapsing. Hong Kong, when I was here, was quite successful. I'm just reading the newspapers now where there's a real crisis developing with all the free newspapers and the advertising is collapsing. I gotta tell you, I've seen it before so many times I don't even want to tell you. You can look forward to the time when there won't be newspapers in Hong Kong. Not that far away, not that far away. Bill Gates said that in the United States, and people thought he was a nut. 10 years later, he's about this close to, from being right. So, what was the job in Asia? It was kind of trying to relate to the needs of a very diverse, very large group of media interests. I mean, 2/3 of the world's population lives in Asia. And our perception of what that business was is, well, let's report on Asia for people that read U.S. newspapers back home. Well, that's pretty dumb. People in Hong Kong don't want to read about, only the stuff that's irrelevant about, to the U.S. So what we tried to do while I was here was change the focus, change the direction of the telescope, and report on Korea on the stories that most affected Koreans and to report on Japan to reflect the stories that are most important to the Japanese markets. I mean, we're there, you know, if we can just improve what we're doing and be more relevant to people, we can be very successful. And I was stunned to get to Hong Kong, because I moved the business operation to Hong Kong, to find out that we had not one single financial writer covering the financial hub of Asia right here in Hong Kong. Now that's embarrassing. It's just stupid. So why did I leave? Well, here was the deal. First of all, I can never hold a job, but I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what we would need to do as a corporation in order to be successful, in order to increase our revenue, in order to deepen our relationship all across Asia. And we decided, well, it's important to launch a Chinese language news service, which we never had. So we started one. We started our first ever news service in Japanese for Japanese. We started our first services in Korea in Korean, all done for internet use, all done through partnerships with the local media there. Very successful model. We'd used it very successfully in the US, and you know what? Nobody ever thought of it in Asia before. Here's the problem. I'd spent all my time thinking of these ideas that I thought were really cool about here's a digital product in kind of the area that has emerged as the most sophisticated digital, market in the world. And guess what? We can make a lot of money at this because there's so many outlets and so much potential in Asia. And that's going to cost us $3 million for this project. But here's another project submitted to the board of directors that calls for $20 million to prop up the failing U.S. newspaper industry. Which are we going to do? The $15 million one to prop up the U.S. newspapers, or the $3 million one that is going to make us a ton of money in Asia? Easy choice for the AP. Go for the newspapers. Why? Because the company is owned by the newspapers. The board of directors of the AP is entirely composed of newspapers, most of them from towns that you never heard of. Never mind that the biggest single subscriber to AP services is Google. Who's second? Happens to be a company called Yahoo. Who's third? America Online. You know how many seats on the board of directors they have? 0. None. So they've got no say. And these 2-bit newspaper guys are making all the decisions. So after a few years of that, I got, tired of it and decided to go with a new media company that was doing social networking things for the Indian and Chinese markets and whatever. Anyway, that's the AP story. AP's big. It reaches over 1 billion people a day. So if you can get a story on the AP wire, your voice will be heard. Thoughts, questions, anything?
Isn't it funny that when I wrote the the Chinese name of AP on board, everybody recognized it. It's so famous here.
Yeah.
By Chinese name, so it pretty much confirmed your
Exactly.
observation.
That's
that
the
you have to
point.
do it in
That's
the
the
local
point.
language.
That's the point,
Yeah.
And if you're not able to treat a distinct market as a distinct market and just try and package them with the rest of the world, you're not going to be successful. You just won't. It's self-evident. Here's another observation on the media. I spent a lot of time with a nonprofit doing work for the United Nations, among others, doing training for journalists in the former Soviet Union, where the task at hand was to try and teach them basic media skills. people that had grown up thinking it's not okay to ask questions. And the fundamental task was to convince young journalists, people your age, it's okay to ask why. That's all right, you know, that make them uncomfortable, but ask why.
Most of our students are a little bit uncomfortable in articulating their questions in English because it's not native.
I understand.
Yeah.
And if I'm speaking too fast, tell me, I can slow down.
So if you have any questions for the speaker, you can say it in Chinese, and I'll do the translation for you. But at least I think it's a very good opportunity, you know, to have your question answered.
So here was the thought I had. Let me just finish, and then maybe this will prompt a question. I hadn't had that experience of kind of trying to convince people that it was okay to ask the question why until I started spending a lot of time in Beijing. And there was a very interesting phenomenon there because it was very much not okay to ask questions there, particularly if something happens. And I spent all my time dealing with Xinhua, who essentially wanted to make every decision, own every market, control everything. But I would submit to you that there is a very interesting revolution going on in that sense, because I think young people are much less willing to accept that than their parents were, and a big part of that has to do with the internet.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, what would be your suggestion in terms of the cross-cultural, cross-language circulation of a piece of news, knowing that there will always be cultural barrier and language barrier when a piece of, let's say, press release going from place to place through the new media. In your case, you try to do that to Kelloggs by posting it to different websites. And it's obviously you did it in English, right? Did anybody translate that into a local language for you?
Yeah, actually that shocked me. But I didn't see it in Chinese. In fact, I didn't find a single website in Hong Kong that carried the story. But we found it all over Danish websites, German websites, French websites, Spanish. There were even some Japanese and Korean sites that carried local language versions of the same story. In terms of advice on how to do that, it's really straightforward. Know your market. Know what resonates in that particular culture. And that's not an easy question to answer. But savvy use of the media is all about trying to understand the market that you're trying to reach. If that makes sense. Yes.
Maybe I hope you don't mind how I ask you this question. Yes, as you know, the modern media will have a big crash to the traditional media, especially the paper or the magazine, because some news will be the news in the newspaper may for the audience may a little bit old because they will access it from the internet and they can saw them on through with their iPad and iPhone and something internet machine. But what your papers published will be lower price and they will have a little bit dirty when they were washing. And will you think the paper industry will be cut off or shut down in a few, maybe 15 years later? Or how will you or your company as APU was at a big responsibility, because many people will have a job or they would lost their job?
Well, the short answer is you will determine that, not me. And the newspapers have some serious problems to cope with. And you mentioned several of them, but one of them is anything that's newsworthy you have probably already read on your iPad or on your phone or wherever it is. You read it before you saw it in the newspaper. So doing both isn't something that people do a lot of. And I also am pretty well convinced that the younger the market, the less dependence on newspapers, the more dependence on the internet, and that's just a fact. How long, newspapers can die like this, or they can die in a much slower arc. And that has everything to do with their learning to adapt quickly and adopt different practices and try to provide different sorts of information that isn't available on the internet. In my country, the newspapers were incredibly slow at doing anything, and then when they finally did, they did invariably the wrong thing. Japanese newspapers have adapted much, much more successfully, having mostly to do with business practices. But the short answer is, I don't know, I can't answer that, but I don't like newspapers' chances.
Well, in the United States, a lot of them are shutting down, right?
When I started out at the Associated Press, we served 2,100 newspapers in the U.S. By the time I left, that number was down to 1,300. I don't know what it is today, but that's a lot of deaths in the family. Yeah.
From my observation, I think nowadays many newspaper companies, they build up their own websites, and then they maybe they can have more quick reactions to the real-time news, and I think the new media, the internet, just provide an equal opportunity to for everyone to be news sources.
Right.
So, but the question is, we used to accept kind of official news.
Right.
While someone else is posting the news, if he is like a celebrity, we will consider it as a newspaper or something like. We value their information more than others, and maybe those most valued information is wrong, or and otherwise some other information from the common people, their news is like truth, or but on the internet the information transfer very quickly, so it's hard for the truth to come up and the wrong news to come down. So how do you think how do you think we can solve this problem?
You've hit on a really interesting point. Let me tell you how it works from the inside. The way that most newspapers reacted to the threat of the internet was to say, well, we're going to put everything on the internet, but we're going to wait till after it's published in the paper. Well, guess what? That didn't work. So the next answer that they came up with was, well, look, we're going to hold our local news that we produced, that's our work product, and we'll hold that till it's in the paper first. But the other stuff, the AP news, the wire service news, we will publish immediately. Now, here's the interesting point about that. Remember when I said that we put out a press release and it automatically went on to 3,000 websites? This is why. The newspapers on their websites want to get the news out quickly if it isn't about their own market. And so what they have done is reach business deals with the major wholesalers, if you will, of news, the wire services, the AP, the Business Wire, and so on and so forth. So they can funnel that news out onto the internet instantaneously without ever having looked at it. They don't have the people to go through and parse it all. So it just all gets put out. So if you know how to do it, you can get onto those wires and it suddenly will be in front of millions and millions and millions of people without anyone anywhere ever having made a decision to publish it. Does that make sense? That's what's going on.
Yes, I mean, so how can we recognize what's true and what's false, and then we deliver the truth and instead of the false?
You have to look at that in more than one way. There are certain things that you can do as an individual, and then there are certain things that you have to depend upon reputable news organizations to do for you. And those things are important, so you have to reward them for it. In terms of doing things on your own, there's a number of questions, and this really would be a legitimate college course to teach people how to be smart consumers of information. But the obvious things, the top of mind things are, where's it coming from? Who's telling me this? And what do they stand to gain by me thinking about it? That's question one. Is it only coming from one source, or are there multiple sources that this information can be checked on? The fewer sources it has, the less chance it has of being true. And I could do probably a dozen of those sorts of things, which, would help you start to understand how to do this job of parsing the news and making judgments on what's true, what's not true. And, But then there is, at a kind of meta level, there are some things that you just can't do. You don't have the resources to do it. How effective are social welfare programs administered by the Hong Kong government? I don't know, and you don't know either. And you don't have the resources to find out unless you plan to spend a whole bunch of time digging into source material. You understand what I'm saying? So, you need to call upon news organizations that you trust and insist that they play that role of watchdog, and insist that you hold, that they be held just as accountable as government officials or corporate officials. Demand that they do investigative reporting. And if you're not seeing it, write a letter to the editor. Hell, you know how, it's easy to make a stink, right? That's what I was just talking about. Your voice can be heard. You have to use it. And you have to demand things from your media outlets. You can't just passively accept that they're going to do right by you. By the way, there is another tool that I'll just mention. We spent, again, I was fortunate enough to do this nonprofit program for the United Nations throughout Africa. And the problem that they had was one of dictatorial governments, which would not permit any information about government programs, about this, that. They just didn't want anybody to read about it. They didn't want people to know. Didn't like questions. However, there's some interesting things that citizens can do. There's some interesting things that media people in those countries can do, even though their efforts are severely limited. Here's an example. If a non-governmental organization in your country, I'm not talking Hong Kong, but anywhere in the world, is receiving money from the US government, from a Western European government, from a foundation in the United States, Western Europe, and all sorts of first world countries, it's very easy now to go in using the internet and find out what exactly was that grant for? How much money did they get for it? Who's responsible for administering it? And They were supposed to put in a dam here. Where's the dam? And it's remarkable how many times, if you choose to, you can find out that massive amounts of money were invested in programs that were supposed to do this, and yet if you look, nothing ever got done. So I'm just bringing that up as kind of another tool, but you know, the internet gives someone who's kind of nosy, someone who's curious, somebody who has a bent for finding out what's really going on behind the scenes, incredible tools to check up on your government, to check up on the businesses that are doing business in your area. Particularly in things like healthcare, environmental issues, just a host of them. But the point that I am making is that there are around the world now repositories of digital information that are open to anyone and they're free. Yeah.
When we see the website, WikiLeaks, is it WikiLeaks?
Yeah.
Do you think we should take it serious about the news they are launching, or truth? Because sometimes people hesitating if they're telling things that which is true or not, but mostly quite shocking.
One of the more complicated questions of our time, I will ask, because suddenly you're seeing this tremendous flood of information dumped out onto the internet about things that governments never wanted you to know. So you're seeing these diplomatic reports on, you know, the U.S. ambassador to South Africa thought that his counterpart was an idiot, or you know, things of that nature. Is it true or not? You know, same question. Who's it coming from? What's their axe to grind? Is there a reason why they're portraying that? You have to apply the same media skills. So it's impossible to say if it's true or not true. Treat it as if it's, yeah, that's interesting information. What's behind it? But there's again, there's sort of a meta issue here. If there is a leaked communication between the Russians and the French, or the French and whatever, that has a bearing on people's lives, but it's completely unsubstantiated, should the South China Morning Post publish it? Okay, the fact that, here's the fundamental point. The fact that somebody says it's so doesn't make it so. And if there's a single lesson to be learned on media consumption, that's it. The fact that it's on WikiLeaks means exactly that it's on WikiLeaks. Doesn't mean it's true. There's some kind of different issues related to things like, so the US CIA had these 12 operatives working in Angola, and their names were this guy, and they name them all in the leaks. And as a result of that, maybe these guys are dead tomorrow, or you know what I mean? There's serious complications or complexities involved with publishing highly classified information. And you know, there's responsible ways to deal with that. But the ways that skilled people, smart people have spent a lot of time thinking about, so that when they're hit with that, they at least have some ethical framework in which to begin considering, should we or shouldn't we? Is it right to publish this, or is it wrong? And without media doing that filtering for you, you know, makes it harder for you.
Well, what's your take on the WikiLeaks thing? Is like this Bradley guy, is he a hero, or is he a terrorist or?
I think is a guy with a gross overestimation of his own self-worth. I think he's an incredible egotist.
Wait, the Assange?
Yeah, yeah. That's what you asked about, right?
No, I was asking about the private, the U.S. guy.
Bradley Manning.
Yeah, Bradley, the guy that released it on the U.S. side that's, I guess, in jail right now.
I don't know. I can't answer that. I'm sorry.
But Assange, you have an opinion.
Look, Assange is a guy that's driving a bus through city traffic at 160 kilometers an hour, and guess what? He's got a blindfold over his eyes. Is he making ethical judgments? Nah. He's made one, that freedom of information is the primary interest and it outweighs every other one. Well, in the pantheon of media ethics, that freedom of information, yeah, that's pretty much up there. That's the right predisposition. But it's not the only question. And you have to consider impact on people's lives, and you have to consider, whether release of this is going to do harm to people who are not in any way involved in it. In other words, is there going to be collateral damage, to use a military phrase? WikiLeaks has caused massive amounts of collateral damage. If the question is it probably better that that whole dump of information is out there in the universe? Probably. But there's a huge amount of damage that's been done. I'm curious, anybody download it? I mean, it's there. You can download thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, and there's no reason not to, because it's free. You can have it. All you need is some bandwidth. So if you want to make a judgment on it, try it, see what you think. Having read a fair amount of it, 1/3 interesting, 1/3 garbage, 1/3 some level of truth. That's my kind of personal assessment.
Let me ask you this too. We have a lot of students here right now from the mainland.
Yeah.
And I guess in the mainland they treat news and press and freedom of press and this kind of thing very differently. From an AP perspective, and then also just from a news in general perspective, what's your take on that, and how do you see that developing with kind of this digital technology?
Oh man, I'm the wrong person to ask about that because I've gotten in too much trouble. Hey, I had a really up close and personal relationship with some of the leaders of Xinhua. All right. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but they're our only media client in China. The AP could not sell to anybody else because it was prevented by law. So if the AP News report has on average 6,000 stories per day, the ones that would reach China would be those 30 or 40 that Xinhua decided were the interesting ones for you to read. And even in that group of 30 or 40 stories, they would be, they would be modified to suit a particular idea, ideological bent that they had. But here's the probably more salient part of that, and that has to do with business. Xinhua has made it unprofitable for anyone to distribute news in China. Why? They charge such a minuscule rate for Xinhua news that no other news, besides being prevented by law, even if you could sell news, you can't sell it at any price that's profitable. So this is why I got so popular with Xinhua and government officials. I don't know if you're familiar with the GATT rules, but it's the General Agreement on Tariffs and Principles, which are global rules on whether it's legal for governments to subsidize the manufacture of products. In other words, if you're selling jeans and you want to sell them around the world and they cost you 100 Hong Kong dollars a pair, what if the government steps in and says, we'll subsidize 75 of that so you can sell them around the globe for $25, right? That's illegal. You may not do that. Xinhua does it with news. And so I tried to interest the US government in filing a formal objection to that during the negotiation of, the trade talks with China. The funny thing is that my own country completely blew me off, right? Didn't want to touch that with a barge pole. But for some reason, John Major, who was then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, decided, hey, that's kind of a cool idea to hassle the Chinese government, and so he took it up with them. Not just because of me, I don't mean to skip for that. Reuters has a pretty big stake in this thing too, and Reuters was championing the cause. So CNN called me up, and I went down to their offices here in Hong Kong and was interviewed on what did I think of Xinhua's control of the media in China, and what about this complaint that they're dumping news. That's a term meaning they're subsidizing it and charging rates that are below market rates in order to control the market. And of course I said way too much for my own good and was really, really critical and was a pariah at Xinhua headquarters for a long time thereafter. But it wound up having some positive impact because I think that Xinhua has now changed some of their media practices. They're liberalizing at a rate that I would characterize as glacial, but whatever.
But so the new media influence?
That's an interesting point. Okay, so you have these two major monopolies in China. You have CCTV on the broadcast side, and then you have Xinhua over here. And suddenly this thing called internet starts coming up, and who's in charge of that? Well, by law, nobody.
No, there is somebody.
There is no. Wait. So what happened is that Xinhua and CCTV got into a fight with each other, which essentially resulted in any real jurisprudence in any law being done or any supervision of that law, prevented that from happening for about 2 years. So during that period there was kind of an open season that it took them a while to close, right?
Yeah.
So it's a phenomenon that's occurring as we speak. It's a developing story. What happens to the future of information in China, in your country? And as an outsider, I wouldn't presume to know what's going to happen. I just wouldn't even want to guess. But I can tell you that there are vested interests in the government that will do absolutely everything they can and will spare no expense to make sure that they control what information you have. Because the opposite of that is tremendously threatening. Hey, I gotta go. Thank you.
Before you go real
Yeah.
quick, can you just brief them on, because again, they're looking at potential projects and everything. And I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could maybe talk to them, tell them a little bit about what you're doing with the mortuary stuff and the timeline-based interface.
Sure. I will have to be brief, but this is a fun project. A little personal information, but my my best friend died in a plane crash about 6 months ago. And, you know, incredible guy, very public-spirited guy. He was actually flying his own plane. He was flying a bunch of doctors down to Mexico to set up a free clinic. And he got caught in the fog, flew into the side of a mountain. At the time, it occurred to me a couple of things, that really there wasn't an appropriate place on the internet for people to share feelings of grief and to comfort and console each other. But then I had this other sort of revelation. I went to my friend's funeral, and I expected 40 or 50 people to come. Over 1,000 people showed up. And I realized, even though he's been my best friend for 40 years, and I knew him when he was a boy, and I knew him when he was a young man, and I knew him when he became a father, and I knew him when he became a real man and a successful blah, blah, blah. Thought I knew him pretty well. And yet when I went to this service, I realized there was huge periods of my friend's life that I didn't know anything about. He was a tremendously successful environmental law attorney. Well, I'm guessing 300 people at that service knew him in that context and only that context, and so they knew a whole side of him that I didn't. And here's this other group. Well, these guys were swimmers on the University of Southern California swimming team, and they knew him in that context. Here's the point. What passes for a memorial in the media is something we call an obituary, and it's a little short text thing with one black and white mugshot. And it occurred to me that to really paint a true picture of someone's life, somehow it would be tremendously valuable to have whole groups of people collaborate on that effort. In fact, what if you were to use social networking? In fact, I know this place in Hong Kong called M-Labs that has this really slick technology and sort of cutting edge skills using things like 3D, things like animation. Could you couple that with social networking and encourage whole groups of people to paint lasting portraits of people, so that when their grandson or granddaughter comes around, that digital repository of information will still be there so they can understand who their grandfather was. So that's the project. And we're working on it now. It's pretty fun. Does that make sense? Here's the key thing. If you can do it for people that are dead, you can also do it for people that are alive. We're focused on the one, but there's clearly part of the plan is to try and I view it partly a social networking project, but partly as an art project. This is about collaborating in an aesthetic way to paint a portrait of someone's life, not just to write a little 12-inch, story about what school they graduated from and what their children's names was. Who were they? What was their favorite music? What artists did they like? What bands did they listen to? What books did they read? Were there particular philosophers who influenced their life and had special meaning for them? What was the favorite trip that they ever went on? What was their favorite place in the world? What sports or hobbies or activities did they love more than anything else? That's who the person is. And we have no tools that provide that right now. So my thought was, hey, if you could produce that, if you could find a way for people to collaborate, you might produce some interesting portraits that people would be interested in. Anyway, there's one other thing here. It used to be that people would write books, autobiographies. If they were in a relationship, they would write these long 15-page letters to the woman they loved and tell what they were doing and all this. hey, that's gone. That's what historians refer to as primary source material. That is the information that allows you to understand what it was like to live in Hong Kong in 1896, right? Except that isn't there anymore. So is there a way that you can create a space for that to happen digitally? So it is there. So it is there for future generations to understand life as we lived it, as we saw it. And with that said, thank you very much for your time and attention. It's been fun.